Today's story comes from Final Fantasy XII, the only mainline Final Fantasy title to receive a perfect score during the PlayStation 2 era. But here's the real tragedy. The quality of the second half of the game noticeably falls off. That, to me, is the most heartbreaking thing about Final Fantasy XII. Making these videos isn't easy. If you're a die-hard Final Fantasy fan, let me know in the comments. Your subs and likes are what keep this channel going, seriously. So here's the setup. The story takes place in a world called Ivalice. Long ago, this world was united under a legendary conqueror known as Raithwall. He brought every nation across Ivalice together and formed the Galtian Alliance. Under his rule, people finally knew what it felt like to live in peace and prosperity. But fast forward 400 years, that alliance crumbled. Two superpowers rose from the ashes, and Ivalice was plunged right back into an era of war, with both sides fighting for total dominance. On one side, you've got the Arcadian Empire in the east. On the other, the Rosarian Empire in the west. And squeezed right between these two giants, two tiny nations, Nabradia and the Kingdom of Dalmasca. Desperate to survive, the second prince of Nabradia and the princess of Dalmasca agreed to marry, hoping to strengthen the alliance between their two nations.
In the name of the Father, and in the presence of these holy relics, I hereby pronounce you man and wife from this time forth. May the blessings of the gods light your path for all eternity. Pharos.
Sadly, the hope that this political marriage brought to the people turned out to be nothing more than a fleeting dream. Just 1 month after the wedding, Arcadia invaded the capital of Nabradia. Following a mysterious explosion of unknown origin, Nabradia fell, just like that, wiped off the map. And Arcadia didn't stop there. They wasted no time pushing straight into Dalmasca's borders, marching right up to Nalbina. To push back against the invasion, a force led by Prince Vossler and General Basch took the fight directly to the Empire. Unfortunately, the Arcadian war machine was simply too powerful. Prince Vossler fell on the battlefield, cut down by enemy arrows. Princess Ashe could do nothing but kneel beside Vossler's body, bidding him a final farewell. With the Dalmascan forces utterly devastated and no longer able to mount any real resistance against Arcadia's advance, King Raminas was left with only one option: sue for peace. Or to put it less politely, unconditional surrender. But at the very negotiation table, in a shocking turn of events, the king was assassinated by none other than General Basch himself. The negotiations collapsed instantly. A young soldier named Rex witnessed the assassination firsthand. He was stabbed on the spot, though not fatally, at least not immediately. He was captured, and over the course of an entire year, subjected to brutal magical experiments and chemical torment until his body finally gave out. All of these events were meticulously recorded by Marquis Halim Ondorforth, a close friend of the late King Raminas, in his book Memoirs of Emuse. According to the memoirs, Basch was executed for high treason, and Princess Ashe, overcome with the fall of her homeland, took her own life. 2 years later, Vaan, the younger brother of Rex, is scraping by as a thief living in the former royal capital of Dalmasca, Rabanastri. He's got a close friend, Penelo, both of them orphans, sticking together just to survive. But Vaan has a dream to one day own his own airship and become a sky pirate. To chase that dream, and honestly, just to put food on the table, he regularly checks the bounty board at the local tavern and picks up hunting jobs. During one of these hunts, he stumbles upon his late brother's favorite flower. Without thinking twice, he picks them and tucks them away. Later that afternoon, back in the city, he notices a ceremony about to begin. Turns out it's the inauguration celebration for Vaan Carudus Solidor as the new consul of Dalmasca. Now, this Vaan is the third prince of the Arcadian Empire, and also the most likely candidate to become the next emperor. Why? Because he'd already expertly dealt with his two older brothers through some under-the-table maneuvering. Only the youngest, the fourth prince, remained untouched. Vaan delivers a rousing, charismatic speech that wins over the crowd in Rabanastri with ease. But Vaan? He's not buying any of it. His homeland is slowly being swallowed whole by the Empire. This is no longer the Rabanastri he once knew and loved. So he decides, tonight, he's sneaking into the palace. If the Empire's going to take everything from his people, he's taking something back. What Vaan doesn't realize, though, is that two other groups picked the exact same night for a little palace infiltration. On one side, the Resistance. On the other, the infamous sky pirate Balthier and his partner, a Viera named Fran. Using his agility and his knowledge of the palace's hidden passageways, Vaan manages to reach the treasure chamber where he unexpectedly discovers the goddess's magicite concealed inside a goddess statue. But his luck runs dry fast. Balthier shows up at exactly that moment. Before things can get any messier, Imperial troops catch wind of their presence.
What's going on?
The Ifrit, eh? That's quite an entrance. Impeccable timing. If I didn't know better, I'd say they were waiting all along. Stop running! End of the line. You have something that belongs to me. Damn!
All this way!
Fran, let's move!
Balthier grabs Vaan, and the two of them hop onto his skybike to make a quick escape.
Let go of me! Keep this up and I will. What's going on, Fran?
I don't know, it's not heating me.
Don't have time for this.
Not slipping!
Except, for some unknown reason, the bike starts losing power mid-flight. It sputters, spirals, and eventually crashes near the waterways below. Left with no other choice, the three of them set off on foot. The waterways were littered with the bodies of resistance fighters. Balthier pieced it together. They must have planned to use the chaos of the inauguration ceremony to assassinate Vaan. But Vaan was always one step ahead. He used himself as bait to draw out every last member of the resistance, and then brought in the warship Ifrit to wipe them all out in one fell swoop. As they made their escape through the tunnels, they came across a woman leading the resistance, cornered, outnumbered, and completely trapped by Imperial troops. That woman was none other than Princess Ashe. Very much alive, it turns out. She'd spent the last 2 years waging a shadow war against the Empire from the underground. Tonight, though, her luck had run out. Vaan didn't hesitate. He rushed forward and shouted for Ashe to jump. With no other options left, the princess had to put her trust in this complete stranger. She leaped. Vaan caught her, solid and steady. To be honest, the first time I played this, I honestly thought these two were set up to be the main hero and heroine of the whole story. The age gap wasn't even that big either. I remember feeling genuinely excited to see what kind of chemistry would develop between them. It wasn't until the credits rolled that I truly understood who the real protagonist of this game was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The four of them exchanged quick introductions. Ashe gave a fake name, deliberately hiding her true identity. Can't really blame her. She was clearly still wary of Vaan and his companions. Sure enough, as they made their way out of the waterways, the Imperials caught up with them. And this time, Vaan himself was there, personally overseeing the arrest. Ashe was taken away separately. The other three? Tossed straight into prison. Penelo, frantic with worry, could only stand helplessly on the sidelines, watching as Vaan was dragged off. The dungeon was located deep inside Nalbina Fortress. Honestly, calling it a prison is generous. The Empire had basically just sealed off the bottom level of the fortress, the Nalbina dungeons, and called it a day. Bodies were strewn everywhere, and the Imperial soldiers couldn't have cared less whether the prisoners lived or died. While exploring, Vaan stumbled upon a Sikh about to be executed in what was clearly a botched, unjust proceeding. He stepped in to stop it, which, of course, dragged him right into even deeper trouble. He was forced into a cage match against the Sikh. A brutal steel cage fight to the death. Luckily, Balthier showed up just in time, and together they absolutely wrecked the Sikh warrior. Now, Balthier is a very well-known sky pirate. And with that kind of reputation comes one thing, a massive bounty on his head. Enter Bagamnon, a Banga bounty hunter who'd been tracking Balthier for quite some time. But his short fuse and reckless nature got the better of him, and he immediately clashed with the Imperial troops stationed there. The whole situation was spiraling out of control, until a judge from Arcadia stepped in to mediate and shut it all down. See, the judges are the elite armed guard of House Solidor, the ruling family of Arcadia. They're also the true commanders of the Imperial forces, operating above the regular military chain of command. This judge's reason for coming to the dungeons? He was there to meet with a certain general. Balthier, ever the quick thinker, decided to tail this judge. If anyone knew a way out, it'd be him. But what they found waiting for them down there was a dead man, General Basch. And that judge? None other than Gabranth, Bash's twin brother. The two of them share the exact same face. And suddenly, everything clicked. The assassination of the king, the betrayal. Now you understand who the real killer was at that negotiation table. But Vaan? He wasn't having any of it. Consumed by rage, his brother's death still a raw, open wound, he threw all of his fury straight at Basch. Once he finally calmed down, the group freed Basch from his chains, and together they escaped the dungeon. Back in Rabanastri, everyone went their separate ways to pursue their own goals. Vaan had every intention of getting rid of the hot potato burning a hole in his pocket, the Magicite. So Vaan did the only thing he could. He went to see Dallin, the old man who'd always looked out for him. After all, he was the one who'd given Vaan the inside route into the palace. It only made sense to show him the Magicite, too. After examining Vaan's little trophy, Dallin acknowledged the kid had some real skills. So he asked him to take on a job. The task? Deliver a knight's sword to a man named Vossler. The hope was that seeing the blade would rally the scattered remnants and bring them back together. Of course, the old man, with his ear always to the ground, had almost certainly already gotten word of Bash's return. Vossler's location turned out to be a resistance hideout. The people inside weren't exactly quick to buy the story, that it was Bash's judge brother who had assassinated the king. Basch explained the truth. Rex had been deliberately kept alive, just barely, so that the scene would look convincing, like Basch himself was the killer, caught in the act. Faced with nothing but Bash's word, Vossler couldn't afford to fully trust him. But the princess still needed saving. That said, he wasn't about to send his people to march blindly alongside Basch. His men's lives weren't a gamble he was willing to take. Then again, he never said he wouldn't go himself, did he? After the two of them left the hideout, Basch caught sight of a group of orphans playing nearby. The weight of everything came crashing down on him. The guilt was written all over his face. But Vaan, he looked up at the imperial flag flying over the city and made his choice. He chose to believe in Basch. After that, Basch asked Vaan to take him to see Balthier. There was somewhere he needed to go, and for that he needed a ride. When they finally tracked down Balthier, they found the usually easygoing tavern owner absolutely fuming. The reason? Penelo had been kidnapped by Bagamnon and taken to the Lhusu mines up in Bhujerba. And the ransom demand? Balthier himself. As it happened, Basch also needed to go to Bhujerba to negotiate with Marquis Ondor there. Since they were all headed the same way, the party regrouped once more and set course for Bhujerba.
Cheap airship enough for you?
The straw. You really are a sky pirate.
Well, the headhunters seem to think so. What's a good word? Is she ready?
So is she armed? How fast is she? Could she take the Ifrit?
I suppose I could tell you, but... wouldn't you rather see for yourself?
Yeah.
Fran, our course.
The shortest way is over Dorstonis.
How flies Bhujerba?
Oh, she's free as can be, for now. The Empire took notice when they announced the princess's unfortunate suicide and your untimely execution.
If it becomes known that I'm alive, the Marquis will lose their favor.
I'll try to steer clear of such things. Right, it's time to fly. And No wagging tongues or you'll like to bite them off.
I'm coming, Penelo.
Bhujerba is a floating city governed by Marquis Andor. For years, he'd been cooperating with the Empire on post-war reconciliation efforts, which made Bhujerba one of the rare truly neutral nations in the world. On the surface, the Marquis seemed to be firmly in the Empire's camp, but rumors had been circulating that he was secretly funneling funds to support the resistance behind the scenes. No sooner had they stepped out of the airship terminal than they met a young boy who introduced himself as Lamont. But this kid, he didn't carry himself like a child at all. There was something distinctly off about his demeanor, a maturity far beyond his years. When he overheard the group discussing their plan to head into the Lhusu mines, he asked if he could tag along. And in a genuinely surprising move, Balthier, who usually avoided anything remotely troublesome, actually agreed to the kid's request. Yeah, something wasn't adding up. Along the journey, Lamont displayed an astonishing depth of knowledge, speaking with familiarity about all kinds of political matters. This, naturally, only deepened everyone's curiosity about who this boy really was. The five of them pressed deeper into the mines. Then, abruptly, Lamont stopped. He pulled out a piece of manufactured nethicite. This kind of nethicite was different from the one Vaan was carrying. It actively absorbed the mist around it, and every piece of it came from one place, the Draklor laboratory. The raw material, the very magicite ore beneath their feet. The moment that lab name dropped, Balthier's composure cracked hard. Draklor Laboratory was highly classified, the kind of place only the real players at the top even knew about. He shoved Lamont against the wall, demanding to know who this kid really was. But then, an all-too-familiar and thoroughly unwelcome voice rang out. Bagamnon made his entrance, brandishing that massive circular blade of his, blocking a path ahead. Then the big idiot casually mentioned that he'd actually let Penelo go, way back when the others were only halfway into the mines. Lamont seized the opening. He snatched the manufactured nethicite off the ground and bolted toward the mine entrance. The rest of the group didn't waste a second and took off after him. Through the twisting, winding tunnels they ran, a chaotic chase through the depths until they finally managed to shake Bagamnon off their tail. But in the chaos, Lamont had vanished too. As soon as they got out of the mines, they spotted Lamont walking straight toward a judge. Turns out, his real name was Larso. His true identity? The fourth prince of the Arcadian Empire. And standing there alongside the Imperial troops was Penelo. Larser, putting two and two together, recalled that Vaan had mentioned a friend who'd been captured and brought to the mines. This had to be her. Taking Penelo by the hand, he led her away from the scene. It was pretty clear that this young prince wasn't cut from the same cloth as Vaan. No deep scheming, no hidden daggers. Larsa seemed to be a genuinely decent person. Now the immediate problem was how to get an audience with Marquis Andor. Standard channels? That wasn't happening. After some serious thinking, they settled on a plan, spread the word that Basch was still alive. Years earlier, the Marquis himself had publicly announced Basch's execution for high treason. If word got out that Basch was, in fact, very much not dead, it would be extremely damaging, both for the Marquis and for the Resistance. So damaging, in fact, that they might just come looking for him first. The gambit worked like a charm. Before long, the Marquis summoned them to a private audience. Basch and Vaan didn't dance around the issue. They got straight to the point. They wanted to rescue Ashe and Penelo. But they were too late. Larser had already reunited with the Empire, and he and Penelo were set to depart for Rabanastri that very night. Time was running out. Desperate, Basch resorted to posing as an assassin, using the ruse as a way to get aboard the airship where Ashe and Penelo were being held. The moment Ashe laid eyes on Basch, pure rage took over. Without a word, she slapped him hard across the face. She hadn't forgotten. She hadn't forgiven. Meanwhile, with the judges verifying the truth, the rest of the group finally understood Ashe really was the Princess of Dalmasca. But there was a catch. Without concrete proof of her royal identity, she'd be treated as nothing more than a resistance operative. And the sentence for that? The gallows. Just then, Basch cut in. The Dusk Shard can prove Ashe's identity, and he's the only one who knows where it's hidden. And then came the dramatic twist, because the Dusk Shard, it was the very same stone Vaan had stolen earlier. And right now, it was glowing brightly for everyone to see. Left with no other choice, Vaan handed it over to buy them a fighting chance. On the way to the holding cells, the group executed a perfectly coordinated takedown, flooring every guard in their path. And one of the people helping? None other than Vossler. He'd infiltrated the airship using standard Imperial issue gear. He still couldn't bring himself to fully trust Basch, but for the princess's sake, he was willing to set that aside and fight alongside them. After a frantic search through the airship, they finally located Ashe and broke her free. As they scrambled for an escape route, they just so happened to run into Larsa and Penelo, who were also making their own getaway. Larsa made his intentions clear. He would help them expose the Empire's conspiracy and bring the truth to light. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, as Ashe looked into Larsa's unwavering eyes, she found herself choosing to trust him. With Larsa's help, they boarded a small shuttle and broke free from the larger warship, making their way back to the Marquis's estate. Ashe, consumed by the desire to reclaim her fallen kingdom, sought Ondor's aid. But there was a problem. 2 years ago, Ashe had been officially declared dead. And now, she had nothing on her to prove who she really was. Neither the Resistance nor the people of Dalmasca would ever believe this princess, who had suddenly appeared out of thin air. And Ashe understood Ondor's position. So, without a word to the others, she quietly slipped aboard Balthier's airship, intending to head alone to the tomb of Raithwall to retrieve the one remaining item that could prove her identity, the Dawn Shard. Of course, Vaan and Balthier caught her in the act. With the promise of a share of the Dynast King's treasure as payment, Balthier agreed to Ashe's request. Raithwall's legendary inheritance consisted of 3 relics, the Midlight Shard, the Dusk Shard, and the Dawn Shard. The first had been passed down through the royal family of Nabradia. The second had already been seized by the Imperial forces. And the last was sealed away inside the tomb of Raithwall, a place that only those of royal blood could even approach. No descendant of kings, no entry. Luckily, retrieving the shard went surprisingly smoothly, but just before she could claim the shard, Ashe saw something impossible, Raithwall, long dead, standing before her. And Vaan could see the apparition too. No one else could. Neither of them dwelled on it for long. With the shard in hand, they rushed for the exit, only to find the Imperial army already lying in wait just outside the tomb's entrance. The Dawn Shard hadn't even had time to warm in their grasp before they were forced to hand it over to the Empire. And the mastermind behind the ambush? Vossler. From his words, everything finally clicked into place. These 3 relics were none other than the legendary deifacted nethicite. All those manufactured stones? They were created in imitation of these very artifacts. I know, it hits hard the first time. Someone who fought alongside the party, who risked everything to protect the princess, and he was the one who sold them out. But here's the thing, Vossler didn't betray Ashe out of greed. He didn't do it for power. He did it because he'd given up hope. Think about where he was at this point in the story. 2 years of running, 2 years of hiding in the shadows, watching the resistance bleed out, watching Dalmasca get swallowed up piece by piece. He'd seen what the Empire was capable of. He'd watched the Midlight Shard erase an entire kingdom overnight. And then there was Ashe, the princess he'd sworn his life to protect, chasing after a power she didn't fully understand, surrounded by people he barely trusted. A sky pirate with a bounty on his head, a boy who just wanted an airship, a disgraced general accused of killing the king. Vossler made a calculation, a cold, desperate one. If he handed over the nethicite, and Ashe along with it, the Empire will help to rebuild Dalmasca, and Ashe will be the Dalmasca ruler again. Maybe not free, but alive. And to him, that was better than watching everything burn in a war they couldn't win. The judge, wanting to verify whether the nethicite was genuine, and to witness its power firsthand, decided to conduct a test right there aboard the warship. No one expected what came next. The nethicite detonated in an instant, obliterating the entire Imperial fleet. Ashe and the others, pinned beneath the wreckage, managed to fight their way free, overpowering the surviving guards and escaping in a small shuttle. As for Vossler, the weight of his betrayal was too much to bear. Knowing he no longer had the right to stand at his princess's side, he let the flames consume him, vanishing into ash. And the nethicite? It didn't disappear. It simply floated there in the aftermath, suspended in silence. Just like that, the Dawn Shard, still barely held, returned to Ashe's hands once more. The incident sent shockwaves rippling through the Empire. Andor, publicly claiming he needed to convalesce, quietly slipped away from Bhujerba. In truth, he was rallying resistance factions from every corner of Ivalis, preparing to take the fight directly to the Empire. Meanwhile, back in Arcadia, the Imperial Senate was growing terrified of Vane's growing power. They pinned the total annihilation of the Eighth Fleet squarely on his shoulders and pressured Emperor Gramus to punish him. Their real goal? To maneuver the fourth prince, the more pliable Larsa, onto the throne, a puppet they could control from the shadows. After returning to Dalmasca, the group gathered together. Bash's thoughts drifted back to the explosion that had obliterated Nabradia. It all made sense now. That was the work of the Midlight Shard. With power like that, it was no wonder the Empire was so desperate to get their hands on the rest. But Ashe was no longer the naive girl she'd once been. She had grown, hardened by everything she'd endured. The Empire was a terrifying force, but with the nethicite in her hands, anything was possible. The problem was, no one had any idea how to actually use the stone. To find answers, they sought out the Elder of the Gareth, who revealed the harsh truth. The Dawn Shard had been completely drained of its power during the earlier explosion. By his estimate, it wouldn't be usable again until, well, roughly around the time Ashe's grandchildren were walking the earth. That's when Larsa appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, among the Gareth. He was visibly anxious, and he came with an urgent plea. He begged Ashe to travel to Mountain Bur-Omisace and receive the official recognition of Grand Kiltias Anastasis. If she could step forward publicly as the Princess of Dalmasca and declare the kingdom restored, she could call for peace between the Empire and her homeland. As Ashe stood there, bewildered by this flood of requests, Larsa laid out the situation. Andor was busy rallying resistance forces across the land, and Rosaria was seizing this very opportunity, using supporting the resistance as a pretext to go to war with the Empire. And worse still, the battlefield they'd chosen was Dalmasca itself. If the nethicite Vane already possessed were to detonate on Dalmascan soil, any hope of restoring the kingdom would be gone, forever. As deeply unfair as Larsa's request was, Ashe had only one path forward if she wanted to protect Dalmasca. She had no choice but to go along with it. Mountain Bur-Omisace was known as the Holy City, the sacred mountain of the Kiltia faith. Throughout its long and storied history, no foreign power had ever managed to lay its hands on this place. Every nation had signed a pact. As long as the followers of Kiltia refrained from meddling in the political affairs of any country, the Holy City would remain forever independent. Just as Ashe was about to formally request the restoration of her identity as Princess of Dalmasca, someone stepped forward to stop her. It was Alcid Margrace of House Margrace, representing the Rosarian Empire. At that moment, the path forward seemed so clear. Rosaria had Alcid, Arcadia had Larsa, and if Ashe, Princess of Dalmasca, could simply lend her voice, the three nations could coexist in peace and usher in a new era together. But that plan crumbled to dust the moment news broke. The Emperor Arcadia was dead. Alcid brought grim tidings. The old emperor had been assassinated, and the news had been kept so tightly under wraps that even Larsa had been left completely in the dark. Back in the Empire, Vane wasted no time. He announced that the murderer was none other than the chairman of the Imperial Senate, and used this as justification to purge the entire Imperial Senate, root and branch. With that obstacle removed, Vane installed himself as sole consul, wielding absolute authority over the Empire. Strip away the fancy titles, and it was simple. He'd seize the Emperor's power for himself. This power grab fractured the judges. A faction of them had always aligned with Larsa, and the late Emperor had clearly intended to groom his youngest son as the next ruler. One such judge, Drace, loyal to Larsa's cause, was utterly convinced that the assassination was Vane's doing. She drew her blade against him. But another judge who also favored Larsa, Gabranth, saw the bigger picture. To maintain his cover and preserve any hope of future influence, he made an agonizing choice. He struck Drace down with his own hands, earning Vane's trust in the bloodiest way imaginable. By this point, Vane was already fully prepared for war. a colossal army, vast beyond measure, had been assembled and was ready to march. And as if that weren't enough, he held the devastating power of Nethicite as his ultimate trump card. Ashe understood the stakes all too well. She needed a power greater than the Nethicite, something that could truly counter it. Hearing this, the Grand Kiltius, who had sat with his eyes closed throughout, suddenly opened them. He pointed her toward a path, a different kind of power. A power that King Raithwall himself had entrusted to the Kiltias long ago. The Sword of Kings, a blade capable of cutting through Nethicite itself. But on the journey to find this sword, Ashe would have to wrestle with a question. Why had Raithwall entrusted this blade to the Kiltias, rather than passing it down to his own descendants? If she couldn't find the answer to that, then reclaiming her kingdom would remain nothing more than a fleeting dream. Riddle after riddle unraveled, maze after maze conquered, and at long last, Ashe held the Sword of Kings in her hands. Vaan suggested a test. Why not strike the now dormant Dawn Shard with it? See if it could truly cut through Nethicite. But the stone reacted almost as if it were alive, trembling with a palpable primal fear of the blade. And in that moment, Ashe once again saw the figure of Raithwall before her. She couldn't bring herself to bring the sword down on the stone. This time, however, Vaan saw no vision. Perhaps that meant something. Perhaps he had finally begun to step out from the shadow of vengeance. The princess, though, she was still lost in the fog of her own uncertainty. Meanwhile, the Imperial army launched a massive assault on the Holy City.
Deaths grow legion.
There.
Smoke.
What could it mean?
By the time the group fought their way back, the Grand Kiltius had already been cut down. Alcid, gravely wounded, had been holding the line against Imperial forces with everything he had left. Battered and bleeding, he urged Ashe to flee into exile in Rosaria to escape the Empire's relentless pursuit. The princess had already made her choice. She would fight the Empire to the bitter end. Her plan? Use the Sword of Kings to destroy the Dusk Shard, the Nethicite now in Vaan's possession. As things stood, it was the only piece of Nethicite still capable of detonating. Shatter it, and Vaan loses his trump card. Shatter it, and the Resistance might actually stand a fighting chance. Drawing on everything he knew about the Empire, Balthier concluded there was only one place the Nethicite could be, the Draklor laboratory. But midway through the journey, Balthier saw right through the princess. Her true intentions had never changed. Deep down, she still wanted to harness the Nethicite's power to restore Dalmasca. That realization hit Balthier hard. It reminded him of his own father, a man who had become utterly consumed by the power of Nethicite, blind to everything else. He'd poured everything into developing airships and then demanded that Balthier become a judge. Unable to bear it any longer, Balthier had seized the chance to escape from his father's shadow. But now, after all these twists and turns, it felt like he'd come full circle, right back to the very thing he'd fled from in the first place. Balthier finally understood. Maybe the only way to be truly free was to cut away the past. And hearing those words, the princess began to truly think. At this point, you've probably already pieced it together. Balthier's father is none other than Cid, the Empire's most brilliant mind. The man who spent his entire life chasing the power of Nethicite, convinced it was humanity's path to true freedom, and Balthier was his son. Imagine growing up in that shadow. Cid wasn't a cruel father, not exactly, but he was a consumed one. Nethicite wasn't just his work, it was his obsession, his religion, the thing that got him out of bed every morning. Everything else, his son included, existed somewhere further down the list. When Cid demanded Balthier become a judge, it wasn't entirely about control. In his own way, he probably thought he was offering his son a future, a place inside the world he was building. But Balthier looked at that future and saw a cage. So he ran, took the straw, and built himself a life that had nothing to do with empires or Nethicite or the weight of his father's name. Except, he could never quite outrun it. Every step of the journey with Ashe, he watched the same pattern emerging. A person with power, reaching for more power, convinced the end justifies the means. It looked familiar. It looked like Sid. When he finally confronted Ashe directly, told her he could see what she was really after, that wasn't cruelty, that was fear. The fear of watching someone he'd come to care about disappear into the same void that swallowed his father. After braving countless dangers, the group finally arrived at the imperial city of Arcades, a place defined by staggering inequality. In the city's center, the privileged lived lives of obscene luxury. But those without citizenship? They were crammed into the filthy, crumbling squalor of old arcades, forgotten and discarded. With help from one of Balthier's old contacts, they managed to infiltrate Draklor Laboratory. But the scene that greeted them inside made one thing immediately clear: they weren't the first ones to break in. Imperial guards lay sprawled across the floor in every direction. Sid's office had been ransacked, papers scattered everywhere. They finally caught up to someone on the top floor of the lab, Redis, the leader of the port city of Balfenheim. But Sid wasn't about to give them time for pleasantries. He'd fused the power of manufactured nethicite directly into his own body, and without hesitation, he launched an all-out assault. During the battle, they saw it, a phantom figure named Venet hovering protectively around Sid. No matter how much they struck, no matter what they threw at him, Sid wouldn't take a scratch. Laughing, he brazenly pulled out the 2 remaining pieces of nethicite and taunted them. "If you want the nethicite, follow me to Giruvegan." No one had any idea what game he was playing, but to get their hands on those stones, they had no choice but to play along. Meanwhile, Marquis Ondor's resistance forces were fully mobilized and ready to strike against the Imperial army at any moment. This battle was unavoidable. The moment he defied the judge's orders to help Ashe escape that airship, it had become a fight to the death. Even if it meant cooperating with Rosaria, he would see the Empire brought down. But that was exactly what Vaan was counting on. With one detonation of the nethicite, he could wipe out both the Resistance and the Rosarian army in a single catastrophic blow. There was no time to waste. They had to get to Giruvegan now. Giruvegan is an ancient city shrouded in profound mystery, surrounded by impossibly dense mist and swarms of vicious creatures. And that mist, it carried the same unmistakable presence as Venet. Perhaps this place was where he came from. Inside the ancient city, everything felt surreal, otherworldly. At one point, they came across a piece of nethicite the size of a meteor, a sight that filled Ashe's heart with renewed hope. At the very deepest part of Giruvegan, they found a teleportation device. Inscribed upon it were the words, "This is the sole path to the Circle of the Undying, a road that guides only the chosen." Ashe cautiously placed her hand upon the device's crystal. A blinding flash of white light swallowed everything. When she slowly opened her eyes, she found herself standing on a circular stone platform, suspended in midair. Her companions were nowhere to be seen. All around her, drifting in the void, were phantasmal beings, their forms eerily similar to Venet. These beings were the Occuria, the self-proclaimed Undying Ones, the so-called Gods of Ivalice, the most powerful entities in existence. Ageless, deathless, they had guided the course of history from the shadows. Long ago, it was they who had granted the Sword of Kings to Raithwall. And from the source of all nethicite, the Sun Crest, housed within the Pharos at Ryderana, he had sliced off 3 shards. Those shards became the 3 sacred relics known to the world today. If mere shards held that kind of devastating power, then if the full Sun Crest were to ever detonate, Ivalice itself might simply cease to exist. The pact the Occuria had made with Raithwall had long since expired. Now, they had chosen a new vessel, Ashe, who carried the bloodline of the Dynast King himself. They wanted her to walk the same path Raithwall once walked, but when Ashe mentioned Venet, the Occuria's mood shifted instantly. Fury rippled through them. Venet was a traitor to their kind, a renegade who had helped humanity create manufactured nethicite. This was a direct challenge to their authority, a blasphemy that could not stand. And so they implored Ashe, destroy the Empire, unite Ivalice under one banner once more. With trembling hands, Ashe gripped the hilt of the treaty blade and accepted the covenant. But deep within her heart, something was resisting. A quiet, unshakable reluctance that pressed down on her with crushing weight, filling her with a dread she couldn't name. She didn't know what the right choice was anymore. Should she obliterate the Sun Crest entirely, or carve off new shards to use against the Empire? If she destroyed the Sun Crest, they'd have no answer to the Empire's manufactured nethicite. But if she cut new shards, she'd just be repeating the cycle, the same path of destruction all over again. And Redis made his position absolutely clear: he would not allow Ashe to wield nethicite in battle. No matter what, the most urgent thing now was to find the Pharos at Raithwall. According to Redis intel, when his ships had approached the area near the Great Lighthouse, they'd lost all power. The sheer density of mist in the air had completely crippled them. And what was the fundamental power of nethicite? The absorption of mist. Connect the dots, and there was no doubt left. The Great Lighthouse was the Pharos at Raithwall. And let me tell you, this place is truly a tower, an absolute gauntlet designed to break the player. Over 100 floors, and the interior environments repeated ad nauseum. I distinctly remember cursing multiple times on the climb up. It's brutal. After pushing through obstacle after obstacle, enduring trial after trial, they finally stood before the Sun Crest. And now Ashe had to make her choice, destroy it or use it. As Ashe stood paralyzed by indecision, a familiar figure appeared, the apparition of Vossler, alongside Judge Gabranth. Together, they urged her to choose the path of vengeance. And in that moment, Gabranth finally confessed it was he who had assassinated the king all those years ago. Then came another revelation. Redis laid bare his true identity. He was none other than Forrest Zecht, the former Judge Magister who had led the assault on Nabradia. The explosion that destroyed an entire kingdom had haunted him ever since, filling him with such profound remorse that he swore an oath to seal away that kind of dangerous power forever. Standing beside him, Ashe gazed deeply at the ghost of Vossler, then at Vaan's anxious face, and in that moment, she finally made her choice. She would no longer be chained to the past. Raising the treaty blade, she brought it down with a single decisive stroke, cutting straight through the phantom of Vossler. And in the end, that was all it had ever been, an illusion conjured by the Occuria to steer her toward vengeance. Nothing more. In the long, long history of Dalmasca, never once had the power of nethicite been wielded in battle. No matter how harsh the circumstances, the people had always forged their future with their own two hands. That was the kind of nation Ashe wanted to rebuild. If she gave in now, if she borrowed the power of the stone, she would be betraying the very kingdom she loved. Elsewhere, Basch was preparing to settle things with Gabranth once and for all. But before their blades could meet, Cid appeared. Shoving Gabranth aside, he sneered that the moment the judge had raised his sword against the princess, he'd ceased to be a judge at all. He was nothing more than a traitor now. Enraged beyond reason, Gabranth turned his sword on Cid. But Venet's power effortlessly deflected the blow, hurling Gabranth backward. His skull cracked against a stone pillar and he crumpled, unconscious. In that moment, it became clear that Cid actually wasn't opposed to what Ashe was doing. Humanity, he believed, had to carve its own path through history, not rely on the nethicite of the Occuria. And Venet, hovering behind him, shared that very same conviction. That was precisely why Venet had helped humanity create manufactured nethicite in the first place. With a theatrical flourish, Cid hurled 3 chunks of manufactured nethicite into the sky. They drank in the mist pouring from the sun crest with terrifying speed. And all of it was being channeled as fuel for Arcadia's ultimate weapon, the Sky Fortress Bahamut. By now, Cid had fallen completely into madness. He drew his weapon and turned it on the group. Augmented by the power of the manufactured nethicite, his strength surged exponentially. But in the end, he still fell, brought down by his own son's hand. For 6 years, Cid had never once regretted his partnership with Venet. And now, in their final moments together, the two spoke like old friends bidding farewell. No matter how much Balthier despised him, Cid was still his father. And despite everything, a deep, quiet sorrow filled Balthier's heart. But the Suncrest had already become unstable, uncontrolled. A catastrophic detonation was imminent. Ashe struggled forward, gripping the Sword of Kings, ready to strike, but Redis seized the blade from her hands. To atone for the sins of his past, with a thunderous roar, he swung the sword and cleaved into the Suncrest. In that instant, the entire world felt the shockwave. As the Suncrest shattered, mist erupted outward in a raging torrent, and the entire lighthouse was ripped apart by the blast. The Pharos at Raithwall crumbled into ruin, and Redis vanished forever in the explosion. Redis's sacrifice weighed heavily on every single one of them. When they returned to Redis's estate, Cid was already waiting. He brought nothing but grim news. The war hadn't been stopped in time. Despite Vaan losing the power of the Dusk Shard, the Sky Fortress Bahamut had still gathered more than enough energy to operate at full force. And now, the only way to stop the war was to board the Bahamut itself and take down the man who had set all of this in motion, the root of everything. It didn't take long. The war began.
fortune favor us all.
Fortress leader, keep your formations tight. Give them a warm welcome. Many more to choose from. Right for the taking.
Warships exploded in the skies above, fire and smoke lighting up the heavens. The Imperial forces, bolstered by the power of manufactured nethicite, seemed utterly unstoppable. The Resistance and Rosarian fleets were being pushed back relentlessly, crumbling under the onslaught.
All ships clear.
Give word to the cannons. Make ready and fire.
Clean line.
Prepare the second volley. Be quick. By the gods.
Carrier Galifal, she's lost. Ship from abaft.
Could it be?
And in the chaos of the battle, Balthier's airship slipped through and successfully docked aboard the Bahamut.
Quite the welcome. Careful!
One follows.
Ah, you want to dance? Then let's dance.
A new partner.
It's not easy being this popular, you know.
Come on. Come on.
But midway through the fortress, they ran into Gabranth. Against all odds, he'd survived the explosion at the Pharos. As Basch clashed blades with him, Gabranth finally began to understand his brother's convictions. One by one, the chains of hatred that had bound him for so long began to fall away. Gabranth is such a contradictory, complex character. Let me take a step back here, because Gabranth deserves more than just a passing mention. The logo of Final Fantasy XII is his armor, not Vaan's face, not Ashe's crown, his armor. That's not a coincidence. From the very beginning, Gabranth and Basch shared the same face, but lived completely opposite lives. Basch stayed loyal to Dalmasca, to his principles, to the people he swore to protect. Gabranth, he crossed over to the Empire, took a new name, buried his past, and spent years becoming the most feared judge in Arcadia. Why? That's the question the game never quite answers out loud. But if you read between the lines, it's not hard to imagine. Two brothers, same origin, one chose honor, the other chose survival, or maybe ambition. And when Basch was framed for the king's assassination, Gabranth didn't clear his name, he let the lie stand. That guilt never left him. You can feel it every time he appears on screen. There's a tension in him that goes beyond arrogance. He resents Basch, yes, but underneath that resentment is something closer to envy. Because Basch never compromised, and Gabranth did, every single day. When he confronts Basch on the Bahamut, it finally cracks open. All that suppressed guilt, all that twisted loyalty, it starts to unravel. He sees in his brother everything he gave up, and somewhere in that moment, the wall comes down. He staggers forward, battered beyond reason, to face Vaan. Vaan actually tells him to protect Larsa, and he agrees, he gives his word. And then he turns his sword on Vaan instead. That's Gabranth's final answer, not to the Empire, not to his brother, to himself. He collapses, broken, but for the first time in years, maybe at peace. The game never gave him enough time, and that's the real tragedy. Because everything he needed to be a fully realized character was already there. The writing just didn't finish the job. Back to the story. At last, they found Vaan and Larsa standing beside him. Larsa had given up trying to reason with his brother with words. Drawing his weapon, he resolved to take action himself. There was nothing left to say. The battle erupted. Vaan was powerful, overwhelmingly so. But even he couldn't withstand the combined assault of everyone bearing down on him. He collapsed. Larsa, still caring deeply for his brother despite everything, rushed to his side, only to be struck by the crackling bolts of energy radiating from Vaan's body. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. And then, Vaan, bolstered by the manufactured nethicite fused into his being, rose once more. His once handsome face twisted into something monstrous. That was when Gabranth, battered and gravely wounded, staggered forward. Even in his corrupted state, Vaan's concern for his younger brother remained genuine. He commanded Gabranth to protect Larsa. Gabranth gave his word. And then, in the very next heartbeat, he turned his blade on Vaan. Even with the nethicite surging through him, Vaan couldn't simply shrug off the attacks of the Empire's strongest judge. Gabranth landed blow after devastating blow. And with Basch fighting in perfect coordination, Gabranth drove his sword deep into Vaan's body. But the counterattack was savage. Vaan struck back with everything he had, and Gabranth collapsed to the ground, battered, broken, but at peace. This was how he chose to atone. Seizing the opening, Vaan unleashed everything he had, a final, decisive strike that sent Vaan plummeting from the platform. But then, Venet, the same presence that had once bound himself to Sid, now emerged from Vaan's body. Venet's true goal had already been accomplished: shatter the Suncrest, and bring an end to the era of Nethicite's dominion over mankind. Vaan and Venet fused into a single colossal entity, a fusion of man and would-be god. The final battle was upon them. And yet, against the unwavering resolve of the party, even this monstrous union could not prevail. As the mist dissipated, Venet slowly faded away, a dying ember drifting into the endless sky. But the crisis wasn't over yet. The ferocity of the battle had crippled the Bahamut. The fortress was losing power, and it was on a direct collision course with the capital of Dalmasca. And to make things worse, the Strahl had also lost power, drained by the manufactured nethicite. Balthier ordered Vaan to trigger the emergency systems and get the ship started. The moment power returned, they were to take off immediately. As for himself and Fran, they headed to the engine room to make repairs. Before long, power surged back to life, and the Strahl pulled away from the crashing Bahamut just in time.
Watch for interference from Bahamut's Skystone. The Strahl's a fickle girl. You keep her working for us.
I'll see what I can do.
Basch, look after Lhusu, will you? If House Solidor should crumble, the Empire would fail, and civil war would take us all.
I understand.
The Lord Lhasa is our last hope.
Vaan, the power's back. We can go.
Right. Let's go. Grab onto something.
Sir, it's the Stroll. She's left Bahamut. She's moving away.
The Stroll. They made it. At last. The Bahamut has fallen. The final test is upon us. The judges shall rule us no more. Main cannon on the Alexander.
This is Judge Magister Gabranth. All forces cease fire. I repeat, all units of the Arcadian army, hold your fire.
Through the comms, Ashe, Larsa, and Basch, now speaking on behalf of the fallen Gabranth, called for a ceasefire. Their voices cut through the chaos, and both sides halted their assault.
Attention, this is Larsa Farina Solidor.
My brother Vaan has died with honor in battle. The Imperial fleet is now under my command.
Sir, your orders, sir.
This is Ashelia Dalmasca.
The Lady Ashe. Thank the gods you live.
I confirm what Judge Magister Gabranth and Larsa Solidor have said here.
Please stand down your attack. The war is over. Ivalice looks to the horizon.
A new day has dawned. We are free.
Look, Vaan, the Bahamut!
But the Bahamut was still falling. Seeing this, Judge Zargaboth resolved to make the ultimate sacrifice. He would ram his own airship into the Bahamut, steering it away from the city. The impact would tear his ship apart, and then the rest of the fleet could destroy the debris. It was the only way to save Dalmasca.
We are preparing to ram her. Do not interfere.
Madness.
Should she fall, the paling will not hold.
And all Rabanasta will be obliterated. All ships, concentrate your fire on the Alexander's remains once Bahamut is clear of the city.
Then, out of nowhere, Balthier intervened, stopping him. Turns out, after fixing the Stroll, he and Fran had slipped right back aboard the Bahamut to attempt emergency repairs on its engines. And against all odds, they succeeded. The Bahamut's power returned, and the fortress slowly veered away, drifting toward uninhabited lands. Aboard the Stroll, Ashe called out Balthier's name again and again, her voice breaking with emotion. In that moment, she made a heartfelt confession, as close to a declaration of love as you'll get in the story. Look, there's definitely a romantic thread between Ashe and Balthier, but the story was cut and trimmed so aggressively that what we're left with feels incomplete, vague, almost out of nowhere. Because if you look at the entire journey, they never really had many personal, emotional moments together. They were always consumed by family grudges and national vendettas.
You know what they say about the leading man? He never dies. Let's fly! Fran, power to the glossaire rings. Fran? Do I have to do everything around here?
Listen to me, Balthier. Get out of Bahamut immediately.
Please, Balthier! You mustn't die!
Please, Balthier. Come back.
I'd say you're in more of a supporting role.
Fran, please. Vaan, the Stroll's in your hands. You'd better take care of her, you hear? If there's one scratch on her when I get back...
Roger that. We'll be waiting for you.
Balthier!
1 year has passed since the war ended. Balthier and Fran survived, of course they did, and they reclaimed the Strahl as their own. Everyone returned to their lives. Ashe became queen of Dalmasca. Vaan finally achieved his dream. He got his own airship, and together with Penelo, set off to explore the world. Basch, honoring Gabranth's final wish, joined the Empire and now stands at Lars's side as his judge. And so, Ibelis finally entered an era of true peace. Honestly, on the surface, the protagonist of this game seems to be Vaan. But let's be real, his presence in the story is almost non-existent. He barely drives the plot forward. If you ask me, Balthier is the true leading man of the game, and the leading lady? That's Ashe, no question. Vaan is more of a witness, an observer watching an era of history unfold through his own eyes. He's the lens through which we, the players, experience Ivalis, not the hero of the story but the vehicle for it. And honestly, if the story had been given the chance to be fully realized, if all that cut content had made it back in, Final Fantasy XII could have been remembered as an undisputed masterpiece of its generation. The world of Ivalis has so much untapped potential, enough to fuel so many more games. There are so many fascinating concepts like the Espers, the Scions of Darkness, created by the Occuria and tied to the 12 zodiac signs. And then there are the 12 Scions of Light, beings that have never even appeared in a single game. That world building is right there, waiting to be explored. I really hope that one day we'll see Square Enix breathe new life into this world again, whether that's a brand new title set in Ivalis or a full remake of Final Fantasy XII with all the missing pieces restored. This world deserves to be seen in its complete form. And that wraps up the story of Final Fantasy XII. Thank you all so much for watching. Until next time.